Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unscripted and Unchoreographed. I'm your host, Niamh, and I am very excited today to have Sarah McKenna Dunne, who is an incredible artist, writer, director, performer, storyteller. The list goes on and on. Hello, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm really excited to be here.
Well, we are very, very honoured to have you. I'll jump straight into it, Sarah, if that's okay with you. How did you get into the arts? Was it something that was in your family or something you've always kind of done or you came to later in life?
It's a little bit like how long is a piece of string. I suppose I'm from an artistic household. My mum and my grandmother were both visual artists, and a visual art runs in the family. Like, we all can draw and paint and whatnot. And so, like, we were always that house, that was a little bit alternative thinking and excited by details that maybe people would overlook and kind of see as the mundane. And I suppose, from an early age, I was involved in a stage school in the community. And like, it was the kind of thing that everyone got involved with, no different than the GA or like the Kyotos or something. But I really found my feet in it. Like from a very young age, I was between dance routines and singing. I would always be finding myself, like, I'd be given the singing roles or I'd be put up the front of the class. And I just loved it. And when the stage school left the community, I sought out a performing arts academy. And from there, we started to do a bigger, I was like more leaning towards professional productions without being professional in how we understand it. But it gave me a taste for what it was like to be on a proper theatre set. And you know yourself, once you kind of get the hook of performing and you realize, oh my God, like I read the opening, and I mean, it sounds so silly now. It was Annie, and I was one of the main orphan girls in Annie. And I remember being behind the stage as the curtain was down and the audience was there, and we were the opening scene. So the whole music of Annie, that kind of all the spectrum of music that plays at the start to build for the audience. We were lying in the beds, and I remember just listening there, hearing it, and I was like, I couldn't believe, the curtains were going to lift, and suddenly we were on. And that feeling, I suppose, I kept chasing and chasing and chasing. Like in secondary then as well, I went and was in Greece, and I was Rizzo in Greece, and had a brilliant time. And it was gas because I was in my leaving cert at the time. School production was only done by the TYs, and I went to my principal and I basically said, because the 6 years weren't allowed to take part in stuff like this, kind of extracurricular stuff. And I said, well, all the lads are taking part in the football, why can't you let me take part in the musical? So I made that argument, and I got cast, and I was delighted. So then, again, it was always chasing that feeling, and I very much felt like this was a space that I belonged in. And I went up to UCD and I did English and drama. And now this is where I contradict that whole statement. I was quite, I suppose, anxious a little bit, and I didn't have much self-confidence leaving school. So because of that, I wasn't in a space where I could audition for a full course. I couldn't have gone to a course that required that. I had to go to a course that was basically a standard entry through the CAO points. The UCD gave me a very good foundation for like understanding the theory and understanding, I suppose, the kind of the craft in which everything comes from. And then I was involved in DramSoc as well. And DramSoc is a whole other kettle of fish for anyone that knows what it's like to be involved in the politics of a college society. But after that, I did the Masters in Theatre Practice between UCD and the Gaiety. And again, very academic, but there was practical to it. And that was where I got the taste of making my own work. So I always would have written, but I never wrote plays. I would have written a lot of short stories. And then I fell out of writing for a long time as you kind of, you try to define yourself as one thing, which is I'm a performer and I'm going to work on all of that. But I kept finding myself going back to my writing. And I'll be very honest, seeing a lot of work and thinking, Jesus, I could write something as good as that. Or seeing a lot of work and thinking, that's actually shite. How did they get funding? And how can I get my work up there? So, you get a good critical mind, I suppose. But that was it. That was where I started to make my own work. Kind of went into script writing for theatre. And I've been very fortunate where over the years, I've been given support and given pots of funding to develop a lot of work. And I'm in this process now that I think a lot of artists understand, where your work is developed, but it's not getting put on. It's in this space and this loop of development. And it's like, that's great, but there's only so many drafts I can write and only so much mentorship and everything before what is the point in in making work if it's never going to be seen, if it's never going to be given back to the taxpayer for the funding. Like, a play is only a half-formed thing in its script stage. It has to be life breathed into it by the rest of the theatrical elements. So I'm kind of there with a lot of that, which is how I moved into storytelling. So when I moved back up to Dublin after COVID, I started working in the National Leprechaun Museum, which is a whole era of my life, and it's a storytelling museum. So what people might think is it's a bit gimmicky, but it's actually not. It's all about the oral tradition. So your folklore and your mythology, and you're telling this to people in a storytelling style. And I realized really quickly that actually the storytelling community, this was the tribe of people that I felt most at home with. That it wasn't the actors, and it wasn't the playwrights, and it wasn't the directors, it was the storytellers. Because when you're telling a story, you're not telling a story to kind of glamour yourself up, or you're to be the center of attention. When you're telling a story, you're telling it because I have this really cool story I want to tell you and you need to hear it. It's not done for you to show off kind of an accent or whatever. It's you're really excited about this thing that you've learned and you want to share it with people. And there's not much ego involved. And that was something I always used to hate about a lot of the actor circles, was kind of combating big egos. But with the storytelling, I then started to rewrite a lot of folk tales from maybe a feminist point of view, from maybe the point of view of a child or the woman in it, instead of telling it as the canon would do it. Now it'd be the same story, but the perspective would just have twisted. So therefore you're opening the potential of understanding a story from a different point of view. And I really enjoyed that whole process. And from there, I took a course in storytelling, which was ran through Storytellers of Ireland and National Armstrong Trust. It was called Border Talks. It was a cross-border initiative. You might have seen it, yeah. I again grew the storytelling community, like understood what storytelling was outside of a tourist-based activity, I suppose. And I was listening to other people and listening to how they would tell stories. And sometimes they would be telling the most simplest thing. And again, I started to realize it didn't have to be this big grand epic, this kind of mythological cycle that you were trying to unleash into. It could be a simple story about how a bird landed on the tree and the tree spoke to it, and the conversation the two had. And that was still considered storytelling and considered as valid as a big Cullinan monologue. So again, exposure to all of this is what kind of allowed me to go down this route of figuring out what it is I like as a storyteller. And I'm still learning. And you know, I'm working with some wonderful storytellers and always learning from other storytellers. But I think for a lot of artists that maybe feel they don't know where to sit in their art sphere, is to go to storytelling shows and because it's a very genuine and human connection that you're making in the story, because you're reflecting not only on your own stuff, but what they're saying. And it doesn't feel like in one way, it doesn't feel like you're going to a show, because it feels like it's somebody talking to you. So you automatically relax an awful lot more in the space and don't feel like you have to bring a kind of a sense of I know what I'm at in this space here, that we kind of do when we carry into the theatres. But also at the same time, it's not just something reserved for, like, people might think storytelling is a very ordinary thing and it's only done by ordinary people, you know, not artists. And that couldn't be more false, because it's a craft. Anyone can be a storyteller, but when you hear a good storyteller, and a good storyteller doesn't have to be a trained professional, they can be the fella in the pub. The whole world disappears and it's just you and that story. There's a wonderful quote by a well-known storyteller called Liz Weir, and she says, the sign of a good storyteller is that the audience comes away remembering the story and not the person who told it.
I think what you just said there is so true, and Liz Weir is incredible. Yeah, and the craft of a good storyteller is, and what you just said there actually made me think of something that I never really thought about before with storytelling. But in terms of an art form, let's say, it's an incredibly accessible art form. And it's an art form where the audience is truly the most important person in the room. I think artists talk about that a lot, about like the role of the audience and whether that be visual art or what have you. But with storytelling, it does not work without the audience. You have absolutely nothing, but you can see theatre shows and they're completely neglecting the audience, but they're still put on. But actually what you've just said there, I was like, whoa, you actually, yeah, you cannot do storytelling without the audience, because like you're not storytelling then.
Completely. Like when you're storytelling, you're looking into someone's eyes, you're looking into the whites of their eyes, and you're seeing the shift. And that was a big transition for me, coming from script writing and theatre, and trying to understand that there is a difference between a one-woman show done as a play and a storyteller telling a story and as one person. And that writing process is something I'm still chipping at, because the nature is, obviously when you're a bit more trained, is to be big and all that, and it's just about finding that balance. Now I probably still lean into the theatrics a little bit. Like I enjoy playing several characters when I'm storytelling, like putting on different impressions and voices and whatnot. And some storytellers, they mightn't change their voice, they might change their pitch, or a little bit of like a crook in the neck to be body language, whereas I might lean into it a bit more. But that doesn't take away from me as a storyteller. I'm still storytelling. I suppose I'm leaning into the roots of the performance element that I do come from. But yeah, the beauty of storytelling is it also can happen anywhere. You know, you don't need the set with the lights and the sound. You can literally be in a field, you could be in the pub, you could be on a road. Like, it's such an accessible art form that way, that it doesn't need, you can add on to storytelling, but at its core, you just need a story. And then the teller is the person who can be anyone is going to share that.
And as well, like what you just said there about you maybe leaning more into theatricalities, that's just maybe your style of storytelling, which, as you just said, I think is so valid and so beautiful that there's so many different styles. And something as well that, you know, you said and we're leaning into, it's so part of our DNA as Irish people, but also I think just the world in general, like every culture and country has stories, folk tales, either giving a lesson or giving the country's history. It's it's so important. So thank you for keeping it alive, because it's really important.
There's a whole host of people. Like I'm only a fresh face here, but I completely agree with what you're saying about like different cultures. Like any indigenous culture has their own version of their own oral traditions. Like Aboriginal culture wasn't written down, I think, until very recently, but their stories and traditions is completely in the oral tradition. And that is how, that's something that no colonizer could take away. Our language changed, our landscape and our names changed, but the story just translated with the language. The story of the land kept in the vernacular amongst the people. So in that way, as long as a story is told, you are holding on to a culture, and it can travel everywhere. And then some big academic might come along and talk about the value of it. But before that, before all of the kind of elements that come in later stages, everything that you've kept alive in storytelling is ancestral. And like, all you need to do is look at when you talk about cures and you talk about people in modern day times who are practicing a cure and they're doing it with a prayer. Like I'm a firm believer that the prayer is just a Christianization of whatever old pagan words were there beforehand. So the act is the same, but the Christianization is just a new stamp. But there obviously must have been words with it before. So again, you're keeping something alive because it's adapting to its times. It's not being lost. And like I've seen so many cures adapt because of COVID, which I really didn't expect to be such an instrumental fear that people had of losing their own culture. But it was, because so much cure avoids or embraces touch. Whether that's hands, some people have to use their mouth for certain activities. And with COVID, there was obviously, you couldn't go near people. So people had to find ways of still performing their cure and not using physical touch or whatever it was. So it was again interesting to show that, again, you're talking something culturally that was adapting to society at the time, adapting to the change of environment, rather than being lost and being forgotten and people giving up on it. They instinctually fought for it to survive in a very humble way, by not even, like, somebody I met had the cure of the sprain and it had to involve the touch, so hands-on healing. And then they realized they could do it over the phone. And I was fascinated by this, how it went from a really important like textual thing to somebody ringing up and saying, this is my name, this is what I have, and they do it over the phone. And I've heard that with a few cures. So again, it was like, instead of losing it and giving up on it, they had to find a way for a cure to still survive. And while it has differed from what it is, the prayer element is still the same. So you haven't lost the ritual of prayer, which is the ritual of whatever words came all those centuries before. And there is an awareness that the touch is gone, but it's very easy to bring back things like touch as well. So with cures like that, I'm not too worried about them dying out.
I never even thought of that in COVID. I just assumed people with the cure would just keep going the way they were. And I know as well, I know some people with the cure, they don't have to touch at all. They might just go into another room. But for other people, it's integral. So hearing that adaptation, I'm like, wow. And maybe, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, just because I think a lot of people listening may not know what a cure is. And even like when I went to college in Dublin, I remember I had gotten a cure for shingles back home in Cavan. I'm from Monaghan, but and they were horrified. They were like, "What have you done?" It's like, "No, I had the shingles. I can't afford €50 to go to the doctor." So yeah, maybe you could describe what is the cure.
Of course, I know. I have found this too. You realize actually how outside of your own community these things aren't known. So the cure is the belief that a person, place, or object has the ability to heal a very specific illness based on very specific conditions of the person, place, or object's existence. So if two people of the same surname married, it's believed they're meant to have the cure of whooping cough. If the seventh son of a seventh son or seventh daughter of a seventh daughter is born, they will have the cure, particularly of ringworm. If a baby is born in breech, so if a baby is reversed as it comes out, it's meant to have the cure of the back, so anything to do with back injuries. So there's different reasons like this. There's holy graves, holy wells. People were probably familiar with the idea that waters are blessed. Holy graves is usually because the person in the grave was considered a very good person. Usually they are a member of the religious, and people will take soil from it. They either maybe sleep on it and they return it, or maybe they have to, it's a cure of warts, they might have to rub the wart on the soil and whatnot. Or it's not as common now, but there were lakes where the soil was meant to heal skin diseases, which actually sounds very plausible, I think, because I mean, people use like soil-based ingredients all the time. If we think about stuff from the Black Sea and we think about how that's used in exfoliation and all that kind of stuff. So people would go to lakes that were regarded as having healing powers and take the soil and rub it on it. And this is where the oral tradition comes in, because people only know that there's a cure in the landscape because there's a story about the landscape, because there's a story attached to the name. So outside of Baileyborough, you have Loch an Lea, which is like a big hill, and there's a cairn on top of the hill. But back in the day, the loch is obviously a lake, and it was Loch an Lais, which was the lake of healing. So there was a lake that was once there that had these waters, that had the soil that could cure the skin diseases. And because of that, people would go there. And it goes right back to an older story where St. Patrick is meant to have fought the Cailleach. And again, one of these kind of great stories of St. Patrick defeating paganism, where he banishes the Cailleach, and as she falls in the lake, her powers are given to the lake and all that kind of stuff. But that's a Christian version. There's a story about the Cailleach before St. Patrick was rudely inserted into that story. She was there long before. Like, the Cailleach is probably the oldest deity that we have. So there's a story about her giving this landscape this particular power. And we still know that today because the name is Loch an Lea. But that's why you have to tell the story of it to fully understand your own landscape. But yeah, I suppose that's in a nutshell what a cure is. It's quite common in the border region where we are in Cavan, Monaghan, Leitrim, Sligo. Donegal, I'd say, is not too bad. Fermanagh, the same. In the south, there are also cures, but you're more likely to find people called bone setters. And you don't find as many bone setters up where we are. The bone setters are essentially like chiropractors, I suppose you could call them. They would, if anyone was maybe dislocating animals, particularly if a horse took a fall or a cow took a fall, the bone setter would come in and set the bones. Like there was very much a real element to a bone setter. You know, they were working off feeling the body and finding out, okay, this leg needs to be splinted in this way, X, Y, and Z. Whereas, say, if you take the cure of whooping cough, the person administering the cure has to feed you 3 pieces of bread and jam on 3 different days, 3 times. Now, they don't necessarily have to put it into your mouth, but they will give it to you to take home to eat. And that makes a little bit less sense than a bone setter, but that ritualistic aspect, that's what I'm drawn to. Like the cure doesn't need to logically make sense, I always feel, because the belief of a cure is the most important thing. People always say you have to believe in a cure for it to work. As a lot of the time, it is just maybe a healer saying a prayer over a person. Sometimes they're administering something, but that really depends on the type of cure that you're going for. Like if you take the cure of ringworm, I've met 2 types of people that can do one where it's just hands touching and the other where it is like a plant-based thing that they rub on them. And this man has to rub it on the ringworm with a feather, and he goes out into his garden and he collects a crow's feather and he cuts it like so it looks like a toothbrush on the stalk, and he has to put it on because the idea is it has to be the lightest possible touch that can administer the cure. And what is lighter than a feather? So like there's this amazing sense of magic that is happening still, with not necessarily a scientific rationale, but a folklore rationale. And that's what makes me so interested in this whole cure process, because I have no interest in a logical reason of anything. There's too much of that. I want to go where there's a bit of magic and find out what are these little quirky things that people are doing in amongst their normal lives. Like this isn't a big part of them. They're just, you know, something that they do on a Tuesday and a Wednesday and a Thursday, and that's fine, because there's also days of the week in which certain cures can be done. Mondays and Thursdays are usually the most popular. And the other thing about cures is no one can take payment for it. And that is a really kind of key point of cures, because sometimes people think, oh Jesus, you paid your man to rub a bit of jelly on your wound there, you know, you probably paid a dime. And it's actually, no, this person went out and made a cure and gave it to me, and they stayed at home instead of going out that evening. They texted me. It's very much, it comes from that communal idea of, well, as they all will tell me, isn't it a great thing to be able to help someone? Why wouldn't I do it? I've been given a gift. So they're not looking for an act of payment. And I think in a society where everything is about corporatism, everything is about greed and trying to get money out of somebody, I think it is so important to recognise that there's a tradition here that doesn't have money. And like that gives me some sort of sense of grounding in amongst all of the financial chaos of the world and the power hungry, greedy people we're dealing with.
I've just learned so much about cures, and I've like it's funny as well, because when you're talking there, Sarah, I didn't know that about the bone setters. I had heard of them from mainly like Kerry, being based down there, but I thought they just were the same as people with the cure. I didn't know, that the detail of that. And even when I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh my God, I'm like going into a wee trance nearly. I'm like, this is so interesting. And and I think that is something, like, because I remember like it's very normal where we come from, and then hearing maybe like healers in America or such that take money, and I was like, what? Just me. They're not allowed to do that. You can't take silver. In terms of, why do you think that cures are so popular along the border regions, border counties, and further down south? In your research, did you find any reason for that? Or maybe you have a theory?
I have a theory. I could be clinging on to clouds here with this theory. But I feel the border area and the southwest, they're areas far from Dublin, and they are areas far from kind of main urban hubs. And over the years, I feel probably both areas, and look, I'll only speak in Cavan terms because that's where I'm from. I feel that they've been massively underfunded in different ways through the years. You know, Lisa O'Neill has the song of "We've no trains to Cavan," and you know, Jesus, that couldn't be more of a problem if you tried. I think there's a reason why ancient stuff exists there is because it didn't get the same push for, I don't want to say modernization because that's not true either, but it didn't get the same economical supports that maybe other areas had. Like the closest, like to Cavan, Dublin is probably our closest big hub. But even at that, like Dublin culture is so different from where we are. Like to say that's our next biggest kind of urban centre is crazy, I think, because there's nothing necessarily compatible between the two culturally, bar the fact that we're obviously on the same island and we're Irish and all that kind of jazz and whatnot. But that's what I think with the cures, is it's got to do with the lack of economic funding in those areas, that they were slower to get money into them, that there wasn't, that they're also less populated. So maybe like if your main centre for a hospital was in Cavan town and you were way out in Glangevlin up in West Cavan, it was much quicker for you to go to the fella down the road who had the cure of the burn rather than driving and waiting in A&E and possibly not getting seen to for hours. So there was a practical element to having a healer in your community, which is why particularly like if a 7th son or 7th daughter was born, it was almost a sense of relief or joy, because it's like, okay, great, we've got someone who can cure this thing now in that house over there. And like people would just land at houses. People still land at a lot of these healers' houses. But yeah, that's just my theory for why that is.
I'd say you're dead right. And actually, when you're just talking there about the 7th son, 7th daughter, like Ireland having such big families, like I always kind of presumed, oh, it's obviously to do with, Catholicism, and this like no protection or that. But actually, maybe it could have been to do with the cure and wanting maybe we'll have a cure baby. I never really considered that, and maybe that's true or not true, I don't know. Yeah, and yeah, what you said there as well about kind of, I suppose, community, lack of facilities makes perfect sense. If you have somebody down the road who can literally do it for free. I was going to ask you there, Sarah, do you have, and it's related to both cures and storytelling, do you have a favourite story or cure or both that you have heard specifically in Cavan?
I do. And it's well, the story is actually, it's a story I tell as part of the show, because I suppose it's my journey finding about a particular cure that uses a skull. A real human skull is used in this cure. Now, for legal reasons, I will say that this is fictional, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of situation. And I have a wonderful story about trying to figure out, was this a real cure? Because it was just folklore, I thought. And then the months and months of trying to find what happened to it, and then coming across the item itself and the story related to it. I'll give you a quick rundown without telling you kind of what happened. It has got to do with the cure of the bishop's skull of Mahara. Mahara is in South Cavan, just on the border of Meath and Cavan there. And there was always this story in the parish that there had been once a bishop's skull used to cure what at the time I didn't know. And as part of my whole research, I was trying to desperately find out about where the skull was, how it went, was there any truth to it, was it just folklore? And it all started one day when I was in my local garage and I'm getting my car fixed. And I used to drive this tiny little Citroen that looked like a little red M coming up the car and up the road, and the exhaust had fallen off, so it was making sounds of a boy racer. And I tell you, it's the most embarrassing thing, where people think some young fella coming up in a cool car and they see this tiny little Smartie driving by that had like flower stickers on the side of it. Anyway, my mechanic, he's standing there with a fag coming out of his mouth, and he's one of those mechanics that's swearing every second word and everything is a disaster to him, and I can't bear to listen to him anymore. And I just asked him straight out, would you know anything about the bishop's skull? And I was expecting him to kind of laugh, but he actually didn't. He took a step back and he considered my question, and he said, I sure didn't Maggie have the skull, but she was the sacristan of the church. But sure, she's dead now, God love her. So I'm completely shocked at this, because I didn't think that one, he'd take it seriously, and the fact that he actually had a name attributed to it, I was shocked. So I'm like, right, she had the skull, what do I do with that piece of information now? Because she's dead. And sacristans don't have families necessarily of children. So I was like, oh, I don't really know where to go with that. So months go by, and the next time I hear about the skull, I'm in the doctor's. I'm in Virginia, and I'm waiting in the waiting room. And I'm actually trying to keep to myself because my headphones are on and I don't want to talk to anyone. And some owl fella comes and sits beside me and he starts talking about a draft coming in the door. And I realise, right, I have to have a conversation with this person. So the headphones go off and he asks me that famous country question of what is your surname? And when you have a double barrel surname, that is a nightmare that most people do not understand. So I tell him. And within seconds, he's able to tell me who I am, where I live, who my mother is, what she works at, that I have a scary dog, and that I'm doing all this research on cures. And when I ask him, well, who are you? He says, you don't need to be knowing that. And he goes on and tells me, well, did you ever hear about the bishop's skull? That I went for the cure of whooping cough from the skull as a child. And I'm literally about to ask him, tell me more, when his name is called by the doctors. And I have to leave him. And weeks are going by and I'm hearing more about this skull. And people are telling me, I went for the cure as a child. And yes, I did that. So there's the very real situation happening here where the skull must have existed. People went for a cure, but there's a gap now of about 20 years where nobody seems to know where the skull went. And the next time I'm in my local petrol station and it's a dark winter's night and it's raining and I'm fed up and I'm making no progress with anything, and the whole project is overwhelming me because it's so hard to find information on anyone. You're like a detective. And I just, as I'm getting the fuel receipt, ask the girl behind the counter, do you know anything about the bishop's skull? And the next thing, there is this cacophony of women's voices around the shop. Mary, do you know anything about the bishop's skull? Haven't a clue. Breda, Carmel, Jennifer, have you heard anything? And everyone's looking over the aisles to see who is this girl asking about the skull. And I already look like I have notions. So I'm completely mortified when somebody shouts out, doesn't Breege have it? Breege, who lives behind the petrol station. So I go to the house and this small little woman on a walking frame comes to the door and I tell her where I'm there for, and the next thing I'm brought into the house and I'm making cups of tea, cutting slices of cake, and I've emptied her dishwasher, and she tells me all about the skull, tells me that it was found 200 years ago in a church in Lurgan, but that the skull had probably been put there 200 years before that, which would make it possibly Cromwellian times, very early stage penal times. There was 3 skulls originally, but 2 disintegrated, but this one was kept. And the skull used to be passed around from home to home when people needed the cure of whooping cough. Holy water had to come from the parish of Mahara, and you would pour the water into the skull and you would drink out of the head 9 times. And she opens her press, and to my disbelief, she shows me a milk bottle. In the milk bottle is holy water, and she's written on the side of it in black marker, water for skull, so that she doesn't get confused. And I'm obsessed. And I'm about to, and I ask her the next question, which is, well, can I see the skull now that you've shown me all of this? And she says, I don't have it anymore. When the sacristan died, the nephew came and took the skull away to a different parish. And I think, that's it now, I'll never see it. And so she produces a name, a number, and a date is set. And if you want to find out the rest of that story, you have to come see A Border Cure on the 21st and 22nd of February at 6:30 in Smock Alley.
My God. That was the best trailer I've ever heard, seen for a show. My God, the drama.
Now, for the retelling of this story, I am changing the names just to protect the identity, because I don't really know the legality of using human remains in folk medicine, and I in no way want to jeopardize this cure. So it is fictional, shall we say.
That is incredible. Now I feel like I have to research everything I possibly can. I'm literally going to run back to my nanny in Shercock and be like, what is this? That is incredible. Which you have told us everything about the show. What would interest an audience that maybe has no idea what a cure is? Or is it funny? Is it sad?
There's 2 tangents of this whole performance. So obviously there's the whole cure aspect, in which I'm telling an audience about cures, about the people, about practice, and the hilarious and strange and insightful tradition that we have. And that's one part of it. But the other part of it is a very personal story that I'm weaving through the the Cures story. And that is the story of growing up, where I did during the recession with a queer best friend. And it's the story of our friendship and the story of what it was like to be in a community when all of that was happening, when everyone was leaving. And there was a narrative that if you got left behind, you had no hope and everything was shutting down and a lot of people around you were taking their own lives. And it's this story, and it's a very personal story of friendship, of grief, and of love. And it ties into Cures because there is a very serious mental health crisis, I think, in the border region. There is not a single family I don't know who hasn't been touched and who hasn't lost someone to this mental health crisis. The fact that So Sad, which is a wonderful institution, is completely reliant on charity funds is an unbelievable disgrace, I think. This charity that helps so many people and has helped my family is not supported on a government level. I could go on about that. This is it's a story of basically what does it mean to come from an area where there's all these ancient traditions and there's also a mental health crisis, and what is the future of both? Can you have a future of Cures if everyone is leaving and everyone is becoming incredibly depressed and the sense of their environment becoming smaller and enclosing around you and all of this? Like, the main takeaway I always feel with Cures, and I said it earlier, but when you hear it in this context, it's different. Whenever I ask a healer, why do they make Cures? They'll always tell me, because isn't it a wonderful thing to help somebody? And I feel if we could adapt that as a culture, as a family, as a town, as a community, as a parish, whatever, isn't it a wonderful idea to be able to help someone just because you can? I feel there'd be a lot less of a mental health crisis. So that is the other area of the play. So it's got everything. It's got heritage, it's got queerness, it's got friendship, it's got grief, it's going to make you laugh, it's going to make you cry. But I hope that there will be people who will see themselves represented on the stage. It's always a big thing when I go to the theatre, and it's when you kind of come from this kind of background and you're creating work and you've gotten the academic knowledge on it, it's very hard to enjoy a piece of theatre without pulling it apart. You're constantly going, I like this, I didn't like that, I would have done this better. And you're constantly, oh, that's a reference to this, blah, 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 blah. But I still look at the stage and go, I don't see myself up there. I don't feel represented on that stage. And you'd nearly feel gaslit by the whole artistic experience, because it's like, well, is my experience of living so niche that I don't have a place on the stage? Or who tells my story? And it's like, well, I have to tell my story. And I would really hope that there are people that haven't seen themselves on the stage before come to this and hear a story where they go, I understand this world. This is someone who would understand my experience. And I hope it provides some sort of catharsis for them.
That is incredible. Fair play, and thank you for doing that. And I genuinely cannot wait to see it. Genuinely cannot. Not just because I need to know the end of that story, but I was going to ask Sarah, kind of moving on, but possibly connecting as well. If you had any advice for someone wanting to get into the arts or storytelling as well, I think what you said earlier, which is very important in terms of being from an area where there's not, there could be rural isolation or just, what advice would you have for them?
There is always a community out there waiting to be found. And sometimes, and believe me, I understand the rural isolation very well. So I'm saying this to those who are in that position. Sometimes you might have to be the one that leads the finding of that community. And that can be exhausting. That can be I don't want to have to take this up. I don't want to do this. But sometimes just as simple as a social media post, a word of mouth situation. God, it could even be a bloody section in the bloody mass leaflet of your local church or whatever. Something that puts it out, a feeler for, I'm looking for a drama group, I'm looking to start a trad group, I'm looking to start a singing group, whatever it is, because you're not the only one. And I think being an artist in a rural environment is we have to find our communities. They're not set up for us. Like the GAA is there and those people can go to it and they know where to find that. but we don't necessarily know where we're going to find our space. We have to make our space. And artists are crying out from it at whatever age, at whatever level they're at, because they just want to connect. To say it's right, everyone does everything, is just to have a bit of human connection. I think to start with either doing your little research on what's in your area, and if it's too far out, then putting out the feelers and being like, well, how can I start my own drama group? How can I start my own whatever? It's a bit of a work, but the payoff will be huge. And it's only a little bit of work at the start, because as soon as you kind of have your first meeting and you're like, right, anyone interested, turn up to the parish centre at a Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock, suddenly you go you'll realise who's there. And people will be like, and I know this person, and I want to be involved like this. Even if it's only 5 of you, 5 people, that's all you need to start to then bring in others. Because 5 is you not being alone with this desire. You've suddenly got 4 other people that have your back and want to make this work happen. In terms of making your own work, just start doing it. Don't look for permission from anybody. Don't look for an excuse. Don't look for an excuse to put it off of, oh, when I get this course, or oh, if I read this book, or if I go see that, or, if somebody gives me approval on this thing, just write it, just make it, just do whatever. You can, that's what drafts are for. Start the process. Jesus, anyone that's been in the writing process will have gone through like 100 drafts before the thing that you see on the stage. They'll have scribbled it out, taken away pages, come back and put in the same page, have killed a character, brought a character back, found somebody that never existed before. Like, that's the creative process. That what you be prepared, what you start off with might not be your end result. That's the creative process. It's the journey of figuring out what works, what doesn't work, that you hate everything about it, and then you fall in love with it again. And to accept that process, that it has its peaks and valleys, but not to wait for anyone else's approval to get you writing or creating or performing or storytelling or drawing, whatever your medium is. Just do it. If it brings you joy, do it, and make sure you're doing it. You're doing it because you have a passion for it, not because somebody is making you do it. I think a lot of artists will know that feeling of maybe when they have a commission, or they've been given a bit of funding on a government thing and suddenly they have to create something and their heart isn't really in it, and it's like, right, I'll go through with it, and they do it, but they're looking at the end result and they get no satisfaction from it, because it was just a job in that moment. And while it was a privilege to be able to work in your artistic medium for that moment, in that moment it was just a job, and it was just, I'm going through the motions of what it's like to work in a job, and I finished the thing and there you go, and I'm happy I never have to look at it again. When you're creating your own work, make sure you're creating it about something that you can sustain yourself on for the creative process, because that creative process can be years if you go down the funding routes. So there you go. The book is called Cures from the Hollow. Obviously, Cavan's name, Ascalia, is the Hollow. So the idea that you've got this little pit in the kind of mid-north of Ireland, and it holds all these like secrets, and everything that comes out from it is all these stories. And the book is essentially the transcribed interviews of people that I interviewed for their cure. And some of these people are anonymous, but I'm still using their words because I want to hold as much of them in the work, while also preserving their identity and concealing who they are. And then there's other people that are quite happy to give their names. I was very lucky to work with Lorraine Tevan, and she's the photographer. She is working on taking photographs of some of the people that are happy to have their names. And for those who are not sharing their names and keeping their identity secret, my own mother, being the visual artist that she is, Margaret McKenna, I'm having her create the artistic representations of the stories that are going to be throughout. So it'll be a book in the style, I suppose, of like Vanishing Ireland, Abandoned Ireland, that kind of thing. It'll be like a coffee table read where you can pick it up and browse through it and connect to somebody's interview. It's essentially a book that's a social archive project, which is really what this is. It's not so much about, it's a little bit of kind of the story of how it all came together, but the whole book is really the the transcribed interviews of all these people. And as you read it, you'll start to see patterns, because a lot of these healers have never spoken to each, like they never have spoken to each other before, or maybe never have spoken to someone else with a cure. So they don't realize that what they do could be similar to someone or incredibly different from someone, but the core root of it would be the same. And I always talk about it as a legacy, a love. Most people, cures can differ, but most people will have gotten cures from, say, a mother, father, grandmother, grandfather that's passed it on to them. Because a lot of cures are passed in families. Sometimes they skip a generation. Sometimes they have to change gender as it's passed down. There are a variety of reasons. But when they're making their cure, they'll often end up thinking about the person that gave it to them. And I like to imagine that the person before them was thinking about the person before them. And suddenly you've created this really long ancestral link of people who all loved each other and who are all making their cure, because when they do it, they're giving a bit of legacy back to that person who went before them. And suddenly you've created this long chain, this long legacy of love going back hundreds, if thousands of years, that has survived everything that Irish history has thrown at it. And that's, I suppose, why I'm so passionate about keeping cures alive. This is nothing to do with the belief of cures. It's nothing to do whether cures work or not work. It's not that conversation that I'm having. I'm having a conversation of, this is a direct connection with our ancestors, if you are lucky enough to have that within your family. Why would you want to sever that link? And why would you want technology to be the reason why that link was severed? Why would you want corporatism, Elon Musk? Why would you want all of the modernity that we find ourselves in that is pushing us away from that kind of alternative way of thinking? Why would you want this to be the thing that stops that connection?
That is so powerful, and I am literally going to write that down. Legacy of love. And that, I think, is the best DNA test you could have come up with. You're not selling your DNA to Elon Musk or whoever. That is like, wow, fair play. That's all I can say, fair play. And yeah, sorry, I was just gonna, I can't wait for the book to come out as well. I think it's going to be very, very popular. And for the documentary, how is that working, Sarah?
The documentary, I have a trailer done that I haven't released to the public, and it looks brilliant. And I'm working with a fantastic group of people. Most of the artists in it are based in Cavan, and I'm working with fantastic people. It's just trying to get people to go on camera, and that's where I'm stuck. I have worked with 2 healers who have told their stories to camera, and they were brilliant. And I want to find other healers that would be willing to tell their story. In particular, I am looking for a younger healer, someone that maybe is in their 20s. And I know these people exist, but they are hesitant to talk with me. And the situation is 2 sides of a different coin. One is because there's a social stigma of being a healer in today's society. And the other is actually that they're afraid of being inundated with people who believe in them and who are going to come to the door. So it's kind of, it contradicts itself, both of them do, and yet complements each other at the same time. But I really want to talk to a younger healer. If there is anyone out there who has a cure, or if they want to even begin that conversation and they're like, look, I have this cure, I have this story, I don't know how I feel about going on camera. Look, I like, this process has been going on for 2 years, making the documentary. What's another few months to talk to somebody and help them, through a process. So I'm looking for younger healers. I'm looking for healers that have plant-based cures. Like this can be a separate person. And I'm looking for a healer that's quite elderly, somebody that can track maybe the change of Ireland over the span of their lifetime. And because when they would have been first making their cures, there would have been a much more stronger belief and stronger presence of cures in comparison to ideally a younger healer who will be able to tell you what it's like to have that cure now. So I have this vision. I just need to find everybody. But I've been very lucky. I've been in the National Folklore Archives in UCD. I've been interviewing Cicely Gilligan. She was an author of a book on cures there in the last few years. I'm interviewing the archivist from Collins Barracks, Owen Ruin. He is from the travelling community and has such belief in cures. I'm working with brilliant people, and everyone that has been on my doc so far is fascinating. I just want to tell more people's stories. So I basically am asking somebody, let me have permission to tell your story. So yeah, that's the doc will be made when those tasks are complete. The email for the documentary, which is info@griefofthesevenchild.ie. Grief of the Seventh Child is what the documentary is called, because again, the seventh child is probably the most famous person that is associated with cures, and it's the grief of something that will never come back. So it's kind of a massive play on the idea that even in today's Ireland, we're having smaller families, so therefore you're less likely to get a seventh child. So therefore you're already removing that cure. Now, I'm not saying we should have 7 children in our families or anything like that, but I'm kind of just acknowledging that with a changing of times, you're losing stories and you're losing experiences that won't be able to be replaced. And it's a very short future, actually. You know, we've really got about 20 to 30 years before something that is thousands of years old dies out. So there is a sense of urgency, I think, right now to have these conversations and to just be aware that this is something very unique. There's nowhere else in Western Europe that has a curing tradition like this. They, not to the same extent that we have, and not something that comes from pre-Christian times that just adapted to Christianity through along the way. You certainly have healers in other parts of Western Europe, but it's not from the heritage point of view, and it's a very unique individual thing, whereas this is something that, you know, you can track the patterns of different healers. It's like they all spoke on a spiritual level, and yet none of them have talked in person. They all have a pattern to how they make their cure. With the travelling community and cures, yes, the relationship is very strong there. And again, I'm as someone who's speaking probably very ignorantly on the subject, as someone not from the travelling community, you know, the traditions are very strong there. Their culture is very strong. And again, an underfunded, undersupported part of our society. So therefore, a lot of these elements have continued on in that community that mightn't have continued on in settled communities. And if cures are going to survive into the future, the travelling community is key to it and central to participating in it. Even with young travellers, you know, they would not be shy about going to the holy sites and going on pilgrimages to such places and taking the holy wells, the water, and leaving rosary beads and pictures. Like, I often, when I visit a lot of holy wells or holy graves and whatever it is, a holy tree, I can see like a travelling group of people has been here, because I can see the act of worship on the stone, on the branch, on the tree, and the belief and the genuine care that they are doing. Because nobody is visiting a place for a cure unless they have a reason to be there. They're worried about somebody is sick, they're praying for someone or themselves to be well. So when people are interacting with cures, it's a very vulnerable experience, because they're saying something in my life is going wrong and I need to ask something bigger than me to interject, I suppose. But the travelling community is key, I think, to the survival of cures.
So for every episode, we start with the same question and end with the same question. If you had a magic wand or the powers that be, Sarah, what would you like maybe the government to change in the arts industry or in the world in general? It could be in Ireland, it could be something that you've seen really positive in other countries and be implemented here, or it could be something very personal to you, like, I would really like this in the industry. It's a very broad and big question.
So I'll say the other thing I feel quite strongly about is I would completely transform the mental health system in this country, right down to CAMHS and working with young people in that sector up until adult mental health and specialised mental health. In particular, I would have a lot more early intervention with young people and with children, and a lot more supports available to them. And by God, all of this stuff would be free. And I would make sure that talk therapy, as it is known, is available within a public service to people. I think it is crazy that, I think it is actually completely like, what? That there is no talk therapy available within the HSE. So I would very much advocate for a huge shift in the mental health care of this country.
And hopefully one day it will. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your passions, insights, stories.
Thanks so much, Neve. It's been